All right, just one more minute and then we'll begin. All right, let's get started. So welcome to the May meeting for the Rural HPV Vaccination Learning Community. Welcome back to those of you that were here for the last two sessions, and welcome if you are new and this is your first session. On behalf of the American Cancer Society and the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today, whether that's live or via the recording in the future. Today's meeting, we will talk in depth on HPV vaccinations at age 9. Next slide. We're excited to have you join us. Please feel free to type your name, organization, and a side dish you'll bring to a summer barbecue in the chat. Next slide. Thank you. My name is Christina Turpin. I'm a director for the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable, and I have the honor of talking with you first, but I'm part of a much larger team that encompasses many colleagues from both the American Cancer Society and the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable, who work on increasing HPV vaccinations every day. Next slide. We're just going to go through a few reminders and general housekeeping with you. Today's call will be recorded and the video and slides will be shared afterwards via email and will be posted on our external website for you. For attendance purposes, please be sure your name is reflected correctly in Zoom. If you're having trouble, Ashley will be reaching out individually via direct chat. Lastly, we invite you to come on camera for today's session. We ask you to remain muted until the Q&A portions of the session. At any time, you can add comments or questions into the chat. As far as our roadmap for today's call, in a minute, here I'll review the program overview and how we are in our QI journey. After that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lindy McGee, who will talk through HPV vaccinations starting at age 9. Then we will have a short Q&A session with Dr. McGee, followed by a panel made up of 3 partners who have experience in implementing age 9 in their organization. And then we'll wrap up. Ashley will showcase some HPV vaccinations at 9 resources with you. Next slide. These objectives should look familiar to you as they are listed in our program overview document. These will be our guiding principles throughout our 10-month journey together. Today, we will be focused on helping to increase on-time HPV vaccination rates by exploring evidence-based practices around age 9. Next slide. Both ACS and the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable take a systematic approach to our quality improvement framework. This slide in particular showcases the steps we and our partners not only improve HPV vaccination rates, but also cancer screenings. Next slide. And now we're going to have a quick check-in with you guys via poll. So if we want to launch that poll, it should come up. And you can see the questions here, but we're asking, does your organization regularly recommend the HPV vaccination at age 9? If HPV vaccine is declined by a patient or parent, do you recommend it again at future visits? And what are some current barriers you experience when recommending the HPV vaccine to patients and parents at age 9? And it looks like it's looking good on recommending at age 9. There's some that are unsure. If it's declined, do you recommend again in future? It looks like right now we have no no's and a lot of yeses and a few not sure's. And then I am unable to see any of the barriers. So if Ashley or anyone wants to shout out anything they're seeing there, let me know.
You know what? I can't see them either, so I think it'll probably be captured in after the fact. So
Great. Yeah, we'll give it another minute if you want to respond. Looks like we have about 56 currently. And I'm loving seeing that if it's declined, you recommend it again at future. It looks like a majority of you are saying yes, which is great to see. All right, one more minute. All right, I think we're leveling out. So we'll end that poll. Thank you guys for contributing to that. And so now if we can go to the next slide, I'm excited to introduce our first presenter for today's session. And that's Dr. Lindy McGee. She is a general pediatrician who practices in Pasadena, Texas. Dr. McGee completed her undergraduate education at Vanderbilt University and then earned her MD at Baylor College of Medicine, where she also completed her training in pediatrics. Dr. McGee is currently an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine and spends her clinical time teaching residents at a county clinic in an underserved area. Dr. McGee is also a member of the Academic General Pediatrics Division at Texas Children's Hospital, where her research focuses on cancer prevention in the adolescent population. The interest in cancer prevention has led to projects on increasing HPV vaccination rates in teens through clinic-focused interventions, provider training on vaccine communication, and on anti-vaping education for healthcare providers and the public. In collaboration with the Texas Pediatric Society, Texas Medical Association, and the Immunization Partnership, Dr. McGee is also involved in advocacy at the state level on immunization and e-cigarette legislation. So welcome, Dr. McGee.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here today, and I love talking about this topic. I love having communities where we all share good ideas. So thank you so much for having me here. My mission as I see it today is to convince you to start vaccinating for HPV at age 9 instead of age 11 or 12. Or if you're already doing this or already convinced, as I imagine you are since you're here today, my mission is to arm you with the evidence so that you can go back to your staff and colleagues and convince them that this is a great idea. So as a part of my research, I talk to a lot of clinical staff about HPV vaccine processes and procedures. So I'll be sharing some of those things I've learned from talking to them. I'm very big, like I said, on sharing good ideas when I hear them and on collaboration in this effort to prevent cancer. I know that you've already had a lecture on the HPV vaccine statistics as a part of this series, but I still want to first highlight a few important facts about HPV disease. If you're discussing HPV vaccine with staff or with parents and patients, these are the points I think you should emphasize because these are the things that I find are most unknown or misunderstood, even by medical staff sometimes. If you're talking to someone like a parent who has no knowledge of HPV, these are the points I would make. The HPV stands for Human Papillomavirus. There are 15 types of the virus that can cause cancer and precancerous lesions. HPV is a very common virus. About 80% of people become infected with HPV in their lifetime. I heard another doctor say it this way: having HPV is part of being human. It typically happens during the teen and young adult years prior to the age of 21. And in fact, new research shows that 50% of new HPV infections occur in the 15 to 24-year-olds. However, it typically has no symptoms, so most people don't even know that they have it, which is why it gets spread so much. 90% of HPV infections will go away spontaneously within 2 years and don't go on to cause cancer, but 10% do not go away that fast. Men are affected by HPV-associated cancers at very high rates. If we look at cancers caused by HPV, they are mainly driven by cervical cancer in women and oropharyngeal cancer in men. So note that there are more cases of oropharyngeal cancer in men than cervical cancer in women. And part of that is due to the fact there's no equivalent of a pap smear or screening test for oropharyngeal cancer. Other fun facts about HPV disease: You do not have to have penile vaginal intercourse to spread HPV disease. So I like to use the language HPV is transmitted through intimate contact, which to me better describes how it is spread than saying it is sexually transmitted, mostly because people define sex in very different ways. We also know that most people do not know when they're infected, and they normally have no symptoms at all. And as discussed in the prior slides, infections can last for a long time. It's amazing that this vaccine prevents cancer, but sometimes I think what gets lost in the conversation is that this vaccine also prevents abnormal pap smears and the complications that come with treatment of precancerous lesions. So if you're talking to the mother of a daughter, she is personally statistically unlikely to have had a friend or a close relative or herself who's had cervical cancer, but she's very likely to have had a friend, a close contact, or a relative or herself had to deal with the stress and discomfort, expense, and possible complications from having had an abnormal pap smear. If you talk to any woman who's had an abnormal pap smear, it's really stressful. I personally have had a patient in my practice who gave me feedback in her 20s that she wished she had gotten the vaccine because now she struggles with infertility as a complication from LEEP procedures. One nurse practitioner I interviewed told me that she found that she has much more success with vaccination if she stresses the prevention of abnormal pap smears with the girls than stresses even cancer, just because it's just so much more common. It is important to note, of course, that vaccinated women still need to get their pap smears, but it's very safe to say that their pap smears are much more likely to be normal. You also need to remind everyone involved in HPV vaccine communication that we have tons of evidence from around the world that the vaccines in use are safe, including the HPV vaccine. Although this is presented sometimes as a question on social media, sometimes on mainstream media, and even by some rogue doctors, there is no dispute in the respected scientific community about this. I cannot stress this enough. These vaccines were first approved in 2006, so we have over 20 years of data on their safety at this point, if you consider that the clinical trials were ongoing prior to that. And these are the trials I was talking about. There were 3 main clinical trials in the development of HPV vaccine with almost 75,000 enrollees across the 3 to get the vaccines approved. Once they were approved, HPV vaccines continue to be extensively monitored, like all vaccines. So I want to remind everyone of all the ways that we monitor vaccines for safety. For more information on this, go to the CDC website where it's all spelled out. We have the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Project, and pharmaceutical industry post-licensure studies. Researchers have examined these databases extensively and repetitively to determine that the HPV vaccine to see if it could be linked to any serious or long-term adverse effects, and all evidence does not support any link. There is nothing else that we give patients that has this level of monitoring, and there's a good reason why. There's nothing else that we give on such a massive scale to perfectly healthy people. And as a reminder, these are only the United States monitoring systems. There are similar systems in other developed countries. There have been 109 clinical studies, 2.5 million people, 6 countries, and no serious side effects reported from the HPV vaccine in studies. And the vaccine continues to be studied today. This vaccine is also amazingly effective. For many years, we've had strong evidence to show the efficacy of HPV vaccine and its reduction in cervical precancers and cancers in England, Sweden, Finland, and Australia. We also have the evidence that the vaccine is extremely powerful at reducing cervical cancer in the United States. There has been a recent study showing a 65% reduction in cervical cancer rates in women aged 20 to 24 from 2012 through 2019 in the wake of the introduction of the HPV vaccine. Although incidence rates were already declining because of routine cervical cancer screening, the HPV vaccine has accelerated this progress. Another recent study estimated that if HPV vaccination rates rose to 80%, 53,000 more cervical cancer cases would be prevented over the lifetime of those aged less than 13 now. In addition to evidence showing a decrease in cervical cancer, there is solid research on the vaccine preventing HPV infections in the head and neck or oropharyngeal region. In fact, the US-based study that looked at more than 2,600 males and females between the ages of 18 and 33 found that those who had received the HPV vaccine had an 88% lower rate of oral HPV infection compared to those individuals without the vaccine. This study is one of the reasons the FDA approved adding the indication of head and neck cancer prevention to the vaccine indications in 2020. And I think it's so sad that a lot of that messaging got lost. I have so many colleagues who had no idea of this new indication. I think because it happened during COVID and the medical community was so caught up in COVID at that time. What we know is that the prevention of HPV oral infections is very promising for the prevention of HPV, the potential of the vaccine to protect against cancer. And in fact, there are more studies being done to show the efficacy of the HPV vaccine and its protection against cancer. It takes a lot longer because cancer takes longer to develop to prove that the vaccine reduces cancer, but we know it reduces infection. So hopefully I've armed you with the evidence that this vaccine is necessary, safe, and effective. But why should you give it at 9 years old? Here are what the various official guidelines say. So the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is the CDC committee which recommends vaccines, states HPV vaccine is routinely recommended at age 11 or 12 years. Vaccination can be given started at age 9 years. The American Cancer Society recommends routine HPV vaccination for females and males between the ages of 9 and 12. Of course they do. That's why you're here today. And the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends starting the HPV vaccine series between 9 and 12 at an age that the provider deems optimal for acceptance and completion of the vaccine series. In 2020, ACS updated their HPV vaccination guidelines, stressing the vaccination should occur between the ages of 9 to 12 after examining the evidence I'm about to present to you. This is the language they are using to market this approach. On-time vaccination is age 9 through 12. Late vaccination is anything after that. In 2022, Sean O'Leary, who's the chair of the Committee on Infectious Diseases for the American Academy of Pediatrics, wrote an excellent article outlining why the age changed from 11 to 9 in its language. And the reasons highlighted were improved uptake. The evidence is indisputable that vaccination leads to increased completion by increased flexibility. It just gives providers and families more time to have conversation and more opportunities to fit it in. I think it's not surprising that the organization made up of the people who are actually having this conversation, patients every day, were the first to make this language change in the recommendation. There's a real realization of just how much we're being asked to talk about in a very short amount of time at visit and the true challenges that come with that. Third is just strong and durable immune response at younger ages. When the CDC was first looking at the data, they did not have as much information about the durability of the immune response to the vaccine. So there was a thought that we needed to give it closer to sexual debut to make sure that teens were protected. But there are a lot of studies showing that there's a long and non-waning immune response. And in fact, evidence suggests that the immune response is better if given earlier. And that's why the recommendation changed that you only need 2 shots before, if the first is before 15 years old. Just the fewer vaccinations at 11 or 12. And this is actually the thing that I personally have noticed the most with my patients. I had a lot of patients and parents say, I have 2 arms, I'll get 2 shots. And then they'd only get the ones required for school, which in Texas were the Tdap and meningitis. And then maybe I'd see them again and get the chance to vaccinate them, but maybe I never would see them again. And when these vaccines first came out, there was this big push to have this idea of the adolescent platform. Just kind of like we have the 4-year-old vaccines, and they thought that we have this adolescent platform, everyone will come in at 11 and get the vaccines. But I think it's time to admit that this idea failed. You can hold down a 4-year-old and vaccinate them and they don't know what's coming, but 11-year-olds are a very, very different story. I think anyone who's actually given shots have been in that room where the parent turns to teenagers and say, well, do you want to get the shot? And you're like, of course they don't want to get the shot. And so, you're dealing with less of that. It disentangles the recommendation from discussions of sexuality. And this is a benefit I didn't see coming when our clinic made the change, but it's really been true. Nobody thinks a 9-year-old should or would be having sex. But when you start to delay the vaccines closer to the teen years, it starts to become more about sex. You also alleviate HPV hesitancy fatigue. So the idea of hesitancy fatigue goes into that increased flexibility. So they were finding that providers only had time and stamina to talk about so much, and they were just prioritizing the other vaccines. And finally, just lack of evidence to support saying that 11 or 12 is the ideal age. That age, once again, was just chosen because of this idea of an adolescent platform, not because it showed in any data showed a specific reason to pick that age. And at this point, I think low rates should be seen as evidence against this approach. These are the specific questions I had when our clinic was thinking about changing the recommendation. What is the evidence for what's the ideal age? When should we be completed by? And what's the evidence for that? If my patient doesn't have sex until their 20s, will the vaccine still protect them? And will the parents and patients accept this? So I'm going to review with you the evidence that convinced me. As far as determination of the optimal age of completion, for one, there are regulatory reasons to be complete by age 13. If you're a part of a large organization, you may be tied to HEDIS measures, and the HEDIS goal has always been receipt of one dose of each of Tdap and Menactra and completion of the HPV vaccine series by the 13th birthday. So that's one reason to prioritize completion by then. Of course, there's hopefully reasons why they decided to have 13 as the date, and of course, they had several studies to support that. I'm highlighting here one study, though, that came out this year because the findings were so impressive. It was from Scotland, where they have a national healthcare system with good data. It showed 0 cases of cervical cancer in women who had received at least one dose of the bivalent vaccine, so not even the nonavalent vaccine we have now, by age 13. It showed reduced incidence of cervical cancer if given 3 doses between 14 and 22. So it was effective, but it was not 0, and a lower non-statistically significant level of vaccine effectiveness for girls who were incompletely vaccinated between ages of 14 and 18. Although they do say in the study that this particular population of girls were at higher risk for other reasons as well. But if 0 cases in a huge study is not enough to convince you that age 13 is the key, I'm not sure what it is. We don't know why it is that it's so much more effective to make sure you have it before 13. It's likely a combination of better immune response to the vaccine at younger ages and the fact that patients are more likely to have already been exposed to HPV the later you wait to vaccinate them. I told you earlier that the data overwhelmingly shows that early initiation leads to increased completion by 13. And here's the evidence we have. It's pretty straightforward. You're more likely to get all the doses in by 13 if you're given a longer time to do it. So one study showed a 93% vaccine completion rate by age 13 if initiated by 10 years versus 66% if initiated 11 or 12 years. So even if you gave them more time to complete the series, younger initiators were more likely to complete. So those who initiated 9-10, once again, had a 93% completion rate at 13. Those who initiated at 11 or 12 had a 66 completion rate at 13 and 90.2 completion rate at 16. So if you gave them more time, they got almost up to where those 9-10-year-olds had been, but not all the way up. And every percentage point are potential lives saved. And for those who initiated at 13 and 14, they had a 61% completion rate at 15 and about 85% completion rate at 17. So they didn't get up to the same numbers as those early initiators. Another analysis showed that compared to those who got HPV with Tdap and MCV, those who initiated prior to the others had higher likelihood of completion by 13, while those who initiated after had lower likelihood, of course, because they had less time to get it done in. And analysis of private and public insured records revealed that 76% of privately and 70% of publicly insured patients completed by 13 years if initiated by 10 years versus 48 to 40% if initiated later. More studies show that a high school health initiative in rural Texas by Ana Rodriguez showed that a higher HPV up-to-date rate among students who initiated before age 11 than those who initiated on or after 12. Another found that initiation at 9 to 10 had a 97.5 completion by 13.5 compared to 78 for those who started 11, 12. A multi-level intervention at 2 clinics got their completion rates from 62 to 88%. And finally, an analysis of NIS team data from 2016 to 2020 found completions rates of 93% of those initiated by 10 versus 72% if they initiate later. So I know this was tons of data to throw at you, and that was on purpose. I want you to be like, oh my God, there's so much data here to support initiate starting early. So we know that we should complete the series by age 13, and starting at age 9 definitely helps that to happen. But what about my second question? Can we be sure that the vaccine will protect my 9-year-old patients if they don't initiate sexual activity until they're in their 20s? And quite honestly, this was my biggest concern. I think that this randomized controlled trial from India was really interesting. It looked at the detectable antibody levels 10 years after vaccination. 98% of girls who received a single dose at ages 10 to 14 had detectable levels, whereas 92% of girls vaccinated at age 15 to 18. So this suggests the stronger immune response when given younger. Multiple studies have shown little waning of efficacy over several 8 to 10 years, and studies are ongoing for longer than that. And there was a cohort study in Nordic countries that followed effectiveness against precancerous lesions for at least 10 years and showed a trend towards continuing effectiveness with no waning over time. And finally, a Costa Rican study which showed patients more than a decade after vaccination and showed that vaccine efficacy against infection remained high and antibody levels remained stable. So this vaccine does not seem to be waning. And for my final questions, will parents accept this? Multiple surveys and now experience in clinics tells us that they will accept it. A survey of Latino identifying parents receiving educational intervention in New York had 95% of those parents report wanted to vaccinate their child at the next visit. And I do think we need to talk to them and see what that educational intervention was, because that's actually really high for 95% to be convinced. Another survey showed that high willingness of parents to engage in conversations around this topic, and parents reported liking the opportunity to receive fewer vaccinations per visit, no duh, and liking that it was less associated with sex at that age. So the same things that providers like, the parents like. I've been working with a very large FQHC in my area, and we've interviewed providers after a system-wide change to start HPV vaccine at age 9 and see how it was going for them. And these were their responses. The benefits that they talked about were a lot of the things we've been talking about. The parents seem receptive. They talk about better immune system response at age 9, fewer shots at one time, and other labs and vaccines at age 11, and those becoming a reason to refuse. One person mentioned liking doing it with a lipid panel at age 9. I don't know why, but she liked that. 9-year-olds come to the doctor more. It's easier to get the second dose at age 11, and it focuses on cancer rather than sex. So a lot of the stuff we talked about. They did report some barriers. So I want you to think about this as you're planning in your clinic. Parents did question why so young and want to wait, but most would get it then by age 11. I heard this over and over that parents would say, well, at the 4-year visit, they told me no shots until 11. No one should tell them that because we should be getting a yearly flu vaccine. So B, shame on us. Do never tell a 4-year-old that no shots until 11. And just like practical things, like the order set at age 9 needs to include HPV vaccination. And some parents were confused by the fact that the VIS has that CDC language, and they had some educational posters that still had that give it at 11 or 12 language on it. So we had some people say, well, you're saying age 9, but the poster behind you says age 11. Why is that? So these are all things to think about as you're implementing. And I like the summary side from the ACS because it points out one thing we haven't talked about yet. The vaccine actually results in a higher titers if you give it a year apart rather than 6 months apart. So I gave it to my own kids a year apart for that reason. A consequence of the recommendation at 11 to 12 is that they made the booster 6 months to make sure completion is by 13. Don't get me wrong, it works really well with the booster at 6 months. But if you give it at the 9 year well child check, then you can give the booster at the 10-year well child check, and you still have plenty of time before the 13-year-old ideal age. So I'm going to end with a little guidance on how to talk age 9 with families. The next slides are all from this Brewer article titled How to Make an Effective HPV Vaccine Recommendations. It's a really good article and it's short, and I recommend everyone read it. First, use that presumptive language and pay attention to your words. Don't say, she can get the HPV vaccine today. What do you think? Or, do you want the HPV vaccine today? Instead, say, children this age are due for a vaccine that prevents 6 HPV cancers. My nurse will come in at the end of the visit and give it. I presume that they want the vaccine in the same way that I presume that a patient who is wheezing wants albuterol. I use that same type of language and tone. If they question the vaccine, then the next step is to connect with the patient and parent, which you're already experts at. Ask them to share their thoughts about the vaccine. If they have a specific concern, restate the concern. I hear that you're concerned about side effects, and then address their concerns. Side effects from this vaccine are pain and swelling at the injection sites, and for a small number, potential fainting after the vaccine. We'll have you sit or lay here and watch you for 15 minutes in case that happens. And then if they don't have a specific concern, which quite honestly, I hear more than having a specific concern, or once you've addressed their concern, I like to add, would you mind if I share my experience with the vaccine with you? And then I tell the story of someone with HPV disease. So I may talk about men who I saw in medical school who had extensive surgeries from throat cancer, or women who died young from cervical cancer, or that patient that I mentioned earlier who had fertility struggles after procedures for precancerous lesions. And always stress the benefit of starting vaccination at the first opportunity. And this is a new phrase I'm trying out. During an interview with a nurse practitioner at a school-based clinic recently, something she said gave me this aha moment, and where I thought, we're part of the problem here. For COVID and flu vaccines, we talk a lot about timing of those vaccines and to when you get exposed. So parents are understandably thinking that they need to tie all vaccines to when they're going to get exposed. So we need to do a better job of explaining that not all vaccines work that way. We need to time vaccines to when they're most effective. And for some vaccines, they'll be right before you're exposed to the virus. But for other vaccines, they're going to be more effective if given at a younger age. So feel free to screenshot this and practice saying this to your patients. I'm having all my residents practice it now and see how it goes. When you're giving your recommendation, make sure to actually say the word recommend and say the word today. Research shows that it makes a difference. And finally, use a phrase like this to wrap up if they still refuse the vaccine. I've made a note in the chart to revisit this the next time you're here. I want to give them every opportunity for cancer prevention. So let's keep talking about it. And then actually make a note in the chart and keep talking about it. Never think that just because they said no once, they'll refuse it the next time. And this is the end of my presentation, and I think I'm just at time. So I'm sure they're going to give you the slide again. Stop sharing.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. McGee. That was great to hear. And I love your languaging of talking about your experience. I think that is really impactful rather than just kind of moving past concerns. We did get a couple questions that I'll ask quickly. So one of them said, how do you address the wording of the current ACIP recommendation, which you talked about in your presentation, to recommend starting at 11 and 12, but can be given as early as 9? And so they added a little bit more, just saying, I run into the wording being the reason why we cannot update our health maintenance topic to show patients are eligible or due for the vaccine. And another person kind of seconded that as well. So do you have any recommendation there?
I mean, that's where you have to convince your organizations. Certainly it's FDA approved down to age 9. I wish the CDC would change their language on this. I think they've just been busy with COVID, quite honestly, to change their language. Since I'm a pediatrician, it's easier for me to go and use the American Academy of Pediatrics as a goalpost. I know you can change it within the EMR. So EPIC is a really popular EMR, and you can change it to age 9 then to give you your best practice alerts at age 9. So it really, I think it's just going through all that data and just saying, look, our rates aren't where they need to be. Our current method is failing. I think part of that is bundling these vaccines is failing as a tactic. And so let's try something new.
Great. Thank you. And you're getting lots of kudos for your phenomenal presentation in
Oh,
chat.
thanks.
Yeah. One more question, quick. I think we have another minute. Tips to address myths about association with HPV vaccination and the promiscuity.
Yeah, that once again, I mean, you would think age 9 maybe would make that worse, but it makes it so much better once you switch to age 9 because yeah, that's why I'm trying out that phrase. It's just like, let's give it when the immune response is back. We're not trying to time it to when they're going to have sex. So it doesn't matter when they're going to have sex. Give it when the immune response is best. And let's just take sex out of the conversation.
Perfect. Sounds great. I think we're at time for questions. There are a couple more in chat. I don't know if Dr. McGee, you have the ability to, if it's an easy response. And I'm going to hand it over to my partner, Ashley.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tina. And thank you, Dr. McGee, for sharing your experience with us. So like Tina said, I'm Ashley Locke. I'm an HPV program manager here at the American Cancer Society, and I'm excited to be moderating today's panel on age 9. So we actually have a very wonderful panel of speakers who are going to share their knowledge and their experience around age 9. So I'm going to quickly introduce our panel and then we'll go ahead and get started from there. So please welcome Rachel Cunningham, Immunization Registry and Education Supervisor from Texas Children's. Andrea Polkinghorn, Lead Immunization Strategist from Stanford Health, and Dr. Michael Robinson, Assistant Teaching Professor at Brigham Young University and President-elect for the Utah chapter of NAPNAP. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with Rachel. Rachel, so what caused your organization to shift to recommending and providing HPV vaccinations at age 9?
Well, thanks for having me, Ashley, and Dr. McGee. That was a great presentation. I don't think I'm going to say anything that's different than what Dr. McGee shared, but really, Texas Children's Hospital adopted the 9-year-old recommendation a couple of years after the CDC expanded it down to 9 years. So the CDC expanded it in 2017, and in 2019, we adopted it system-wide. And I think the impetus was really we had strong physician leadership. Our chief medical officer was really passionate about HPV and wanted to do whatever he could do to improve our HPV uptake. And so the idea was really built on all of the things Dr. McGee mentioned, that the immune response is better at the younger age. One important factor was that we do notice that well child visits start to drop as those adolescents get older. And so getting them in early, getting in both of those doses before they stop having their well child visits and when their immune response is the best. That was really the impetus for sort of moving towards the 9-year-old recommendation.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. And Mike, if you could share your experience and what caused your organization to shift to recommending and providing
Yeah,
HPV.
for sure. Just with Rachel, I want to echo, thank you, Dr. McGee. That was an excellent presentation. So I have had the pleasure of working with Family First Pediatrics in my area. They're a privately owned institution that has a number of clinical locations around in our state. And it was such a pleasure to work with them to be able to bring this data into practice. So our biggest thing that we did was we invited the providers just to sit down and listen to a presentation that was very similar to Dr. McGee's in its points and delivery. And it was a no-brainer after that. We had such great success. The providers took to it very quickly. We did a second session with MAs to help answer questions that they had. And it was such a fun and easy thing to do. And it's all for the people. Decrease the amount of disease, decrease the amount of cancer in future generation. I think it's fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. And Andrea, would love to hear from you and what caused Stanford Health to shift to recommending at age 9.
Yeah, thank you for having me as well. A lot of things that Dr. McGee lifted up are things that we've discussed or come across. I really knew of the best practice, and so slowly made steps to essentially request a practice change. But it really wasn't until that provider prompt in the EMR was changed that we really saw some movement. I also think a key strategy is really getting a provider champion on board. So my background is I'm a nurse, but to get a provider alongside you there to really advocate for clinicians to adapt a practice change is super important as well. Lastly, I would just say highlighting to everyone else how poor immunization rates are. In particular, when you look at the national data, it really talks about 13 to 17. And I feel like we create this false sense of how good we're doing. Because if you actually look at your rates for, let's say, even completion by 13, we saw internally like a 30% difference between that and those 13 to 17-year-olds. So being able to highlight and say, look, we're doing it, but we're not doing it on time, really supports people's buy-in too.
Perfect. And Andrea, those are really good points and kind of takes me into my next question. So I'll start with Mike and then I'll go to Andrea and Rachel. But what tips and tricks would you provide to help create buy-in with providers around HPV vaccinations at age 9?
To help providers buy in, I think just showing them the data of prevention and immunity, the buildup of the antibodies and its sustaining effect. I think those are the big things, kind of like Dr. McGee highlighted. Is this going to last? You bet it lasts. Is this good for our person? It's even better than doing it later. So it's a really nice, easy conversation to have because there isn't a lot of drawbacks really at all. Some of the things that she also highlighted were that there's less shots per visit. My kids that I see, they love that, right? My own children really appreciated that there was less shots per visit. It's pretty fun that way for them, isn't it? So it's a really easy buy-in conversation when it comes to providers, in my opinion.
Perfect. And Andrea?
Yeah, so again, I feel that data is super helpful it really paints the picture for individuals. I think that explaining the why, and I mean that twofold. So explaining why it works better for the kids, but also how it can improve their practice as clinicians. Well, look, we can get them started here, and then we can make sure they're complete by that 11 to 12-year-old if we can't get them in between that time. I also think elevating things. So I do a lot of talk about incorporating vaccines into sports physical visits or just because we know that wellness visits drop off as kids age to say, hey, look if they're actually due for a wellness visit and switch it to that. And they can do the sports physical as part of that. So we've done a lot of that. And then we also have something internally that I call a missed opportunities report. So really explaining that, while we may not be getting them in for these specific wellness exams, and yes, we absolutely want to do that, we are seeing these kids, just not necessarily for those types of visits. So we need to modify how we practice and vaccinate to meet the needs of these kids to at least ensure that they're protected from these diseases.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. And then Rachel.
Yeah, we had sort of more resistance among our physicians, and I don't know if resistance is the right word, but just I think fatigue that Dr. McGee mentioned. There was just a lot of fatigue, like post-COVID, about surrounding vaccine hesitancy, and so we I think one of the best things we did was, I think it's been mentioned, but I really identifying like baseline data and seeing what individual provider rates were across our network. We have 387 pediatricians in our pediatric primary care network. So really digging into the data and really surveying what they needed. And that was where we really got a sense of the challenges that they face and how there was just a lot of fatigue around HPV hesitancy. And so once we got a sense of their fatigue, we could create tools that made it easier. So we'd already had the systems in place. We already had it into the smart sets in Epic and in the ordering, and we had configured, we're able to configure our clinical decision support. So we had it in our health maintenance gap starting at age 9, which I think is like at a minimum, a really helpful thing that you can do to just get them used to the idea of vaccinating at age 9. But building on their needs, taking the counseling out of the visit was one thing that we have found to be really helpful. We started a project where we were creating individual provider videos, 1-minute videos that we started making using just a $150 vlogger kit that like TikTokers use. And we would film the pediatrician either in their home office or in their clinic. We had a standard script of like 200 words, kind of hitting some high points. And we would deliver these videos to patients who had a scheduled well child visit 1 week ahead of their visit. And we leveraged our EMR to do this. And I think taking that counseling conversation out of the visit is helpful because it just takes so much time. And we all know that the importance of a provider recommendation. But I think just listening to what they needed, and also even within that project, we had providers who didn't want to be on camera. And so even adapting whatever project you do, whatever intervention you do to really meet all of the needs of the provider. So we had some providers who didn't want to be on camera. And so now we're working towards doing an animated version of this so that those providers who aren't comfortable being on camera, we can create a really lovely sort of avatar animated version of the same video, and they can still participate in this project and still get hopefully all of the effects of that. But while meeting what they're comfortable with, because it is hard to talk about it and they are fatigued, and providers have a lot on them. And so I think just, coming up with like innovative ideas and working around those who are resistant, kind of digging into why and what you can do to address it.
I love that. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing. And I'm going to throw this to Mike and Andrea because Rachel shared a little bit about some of the innovative ways that Texas Children's was able to focus on age 9. But Mike, I guess from Families First Pediatrics, what specific processes or initiatives did you guys put into place that focused around age 9? And then I'll ask Andrea to answer as well.
Yeah, for sure. I also wanted to highlight, Andrea, you brought up a wonderful point. In part of our data breakdown, we ran the number of visits per age. We're seeing way more younger kids. So it was way smarter for us to initiate it younger because we have more kids visiting. Anyway, so I totally spaced saying that, but yes, I'm with you 100%. When it comes to initiation in the clinic, we have a little reminder tool that is part of our EHR. We don't use Epic. I wish that we did. It's fancy, but it's a little reminder tool that works in the background of our EHR that was helpful to bring it up. Getting our providers on the same page so that there's consistent messaging. Because if one sibling sees this provider and another sibling sees that provider, and you're not having consistent messaging, it really decreases the strength of your discussion, right? So making sure that we all were on the same page was really important for us. And then we also had reminder systems that we would reach out afterward to tell patients, hey, this is what was discussed at your visit today. You opted not to have the vaccine, or you did the vaccine. Let us know if there's troubles. And it was very well received by our patients.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. And Andrea, are there any particular initiatives or activities that you guys did that are around age 9? I know you alluded to some of them.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention for everyone is our South Dakota Comprehensive Cancer Coalition has released funding to support HPV improvement efforts for the last several years. So it's always nice to have some financial support for that. So that kind of supported some of our work as well. We first modified our nursing protocol order because we really do encourage that as a best practice for nurses, just to recommend it and give it if at all possible. It takes the work off the provider. And or if they're hesitant, then it usually lessens the amount of time that the provider has to, sit there and speak with them. Then we modified the provider prompt because we didn't really see any movement as far as nurses really adapting that. And I also think that from a nursing perspective, they really want their providers to kind of endorse that type of practice. So then we saw some movement, but still not great. So then what I did is I worked through our executive leadership team to get buy-in from the family medicine and pediatric department chairs. And then I utilized them to filter down this message that, you know, this is what we're doing as a system. This is why we're going to do it. And then utilize things like internal communications to better support that messaging as well. So it's taken a few years, but I'm happy that we're finally seeing an increase of those 9 and 10-year-olds who are getting started for sure.
Perfect. And Rachel, we did have something come into the chat, but would you be willing to share any of those 1-minute provider videos with the group?
Oh, yeah.
See it as
Yes,
well.
I can definitely.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. As well, we did have a question come in from the chat. I know we're talking a lot around age 9, but wondering if any of you have advice on how providers, or any advice to providers or to clinics and systems that are trying to increase completion with that second shot. So anything that you learned along the way that you could share.
I feel like it's beating a dead horse, but I'm always like, schedule the second visit when they're there for the first. That is just, it seems like such an easy thing. And I always say we all have so much going on in our life and in our lives. And I feel like that's the best predictor instead of, hey, let it, you know, come back in around 6 months. Like it's just going to fall off people's to-do list. So I feel like that is the simplest thing. But yet there are those who really excel at that. And there are those who maybe don't. Also, as part of some of our HPV work, we have trialed the success of, let's say, sending a MyChart letter versus nurses doing specific outreach via telephone. The telephone, the specific outreach by nursing via telephone is more successful, but again, more time consuming. So yeah, see what you can do.
That's great, Andrea. I appreciate that. I don't know, Mike or Rachel, if you guys have any thoughts around completion.
Yeah, for sure. When it comes to having a patient in front of you, getting a preventative word in edgewise is so important. So whether it's vaccinations or screenings or whatever it might be, helping my MAs and helping Family First MAs pivot and be an important member of the team was an essential part. So the second phase of our implementation was to teach the MAs the whys behind it, answer their questions, help them, and giving them some ownership as well. Hey, when they come in, can you please tee up this, and this for this age group was really valuable for us. It streamlined provider time as well as prepared moms and dads and kids for the visit. So it was really a nice little addition that we did. We really also, we have a case worker type nurse who helps us with these types of things. And it's so valuable to receive a phone call, a personalized message. Hey, we know that you need it. Please come back and get it. It's a great thing to do.
Perfect. Thank you. And I know we talked a lot about success, but I also know that there probably were challenges along the way. So I don't know, we can end on this, but Rachel and then Andrea and then Mike, if you guys want to just share some of the challenges you incurred, just to be forthcoming with our participants.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I think just fatigue around hesitancy it's really significant. And so not diminishing their fatigue, and especially now that we're a couple of years post-COVID vaccine and there's COVID hesitancy. And so there is some resistance, just not because they're resistant to necessarily HPV vaccine, but just because they're just tired of all the hesitancy. And so we also, I think that's where the whole, top to bottom provider, like the presumptive languaging and all of that, like everybody being a vaccine positive culture throughout the office is really important because, vaccines are the standard of care, right? And so when you're issuing that presumptive recommendation, whether it's the MA when they're rooming the patient or when they're doing that, the pre-encounter workflow, or if it's the provider, when they get that presumptive languaging all the way through the encounter, that's really, it's setting the tone that you're here for our expertise, you're here to receive the standard of care, and we're going to assume that you're going to take us for our advice, take us up on our advice. And so I think that, but the challenge is addressing, any issues with the clinical staff, because there may be hesitancy within those the clinical staff. I mean, we've seen that with our MAs, and again, just the fatigue. And so I think that going back to like just really listening and doing whatever we can do to support them by even if it's things that just doesn't necessarily make sense to us. We've had some, sort of odd requests, and we just try to do whatever we can to meet them so that they at least feel like we're doing our best to support them.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea, and then Mike.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be challenges. I think it's just important not to give up. I did, say it a little bit, but the provider prompt was huge for us because they're so used to looking in that section to see what the kid needs for preventative care. So if HPV wasn't flagging, I think it's just not even, necessarily on their mind. And then again, really that endorsement from our leadership team and our providers who are, those department chairs really helped. It's really challenging to get in front of providers to do education. And I think it's challenging for them to stay up to date on all of the things that they have to know. Whereas, my role is very focused just to vaccines, although still complex. So my hope is always to make that easy for them. And another thing that I was going to say is I modified our HPV report. I know I talked about data a lot, multiple times. I tried to build it initially per the recommendation, but I've learned to use the technology of the EMR to provide a better picture of those who are overdue versus up to date, instead of those who've had 1 dose versus 2 or complete. So those were some things that we had worked on.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. And then Mike, any challenges you encountered?
Oh, for sure. If we were to sit up here and say there was no challenges, we'd be lying through our teeth. Getting educated, strong, professional people on the same page can sometimes be difficult. And even when it comes to something that seems so easy to many of us, why not just drop that age to age 9? It took a lot of discussion and a lot of time to get the data that they wanted to help them feel comfortable. So work through those initial personality encounters, work through those initial struggles, because it's totally worth it for our patients. Another thing that was difficult for us was MAs that wanted to share their opinion when maybe their opinion was different than what the messaging that we had wanted to send. And so helping them feel valid in their personal opinions without having them share their personal opinions was a balancing act as well. So we hear that you don't want to do it for your kids. That's fine. When you're here working with me, if you could message this, that's what I really want to do. I want to help my patients, was a powerful moment for them. So I'm sure there are other little things that I didn't even see on the ground that took care of themselves between MAs talking to each other or providers bouncing things off each other, because that's just how life is. Isn't that a mark of a healthy creature, a healthy organization, our ability to change? And it's a beautiful thing to be able to do.
Perfect.
Actually, I did want to just add something, because regarding presumptive approach, I've had a lot of providers say, well, that feels like we're tricking people. That doesn't feel right. And what I've been pushing back is, actually, I think we as healthcare professionals have adapted this bias we don't even recognize that we're treating vaccines differently. To Dr. McGee's point about albuterol, it's like you're not saying, well, hey, would you like to start, your hypertensive medication if that's what they need? And so I think for fear of pushback and probably even though few, those individuals are loud, and it creates us to change and modify how we're recommending vaccines instead of recommending them outright.
Andrea, that's a good point. And if I might, I love the technical speak, presumptive invitation. I would phrase it different for those of us who maybe are a little slower. The opt out, like, hey, this is what we're going to do today, unless you tell me we're not. And I would totally embrace that.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for being a part of today's panel and really for sharing your experience, your insight, your expertise, your best practices, and even your challenges around age 9. We are going to wrap up today's session and talk through some next steps. And I know we only have about a minute, so if you're able to stay on, that's great. If not, I completely understand. Hannah, if you want to go to the next slide, I just want to revisit our external facing website that we've built for all of you. This is the easiest and fastest way to access all the resources that we share during our 10-month journey. On top of the page under important links, you'll see we've placed important documents like our program overview, our registration link, both of our American Cancer Eye National HPV Vaccination Roundtable parent and patient facing materials. We also have pinned a document that houses our monthly recordings and our slide decks, as well as a resource roundup. So everything that was shared today will be in those documents for you. So please, like I said, put it, pin it, and have it available for you. I'll ask Tina if you could please add a link into the chat for our website. Here are just some of the American Cancer Society's age 9 materials. We have patient education materials, we have social media toolkits, we have reminder cards, and so much more. And many of our materials are available in English and Spanish, as well as some other languages. And if you are interested in co-branding materials, that is something that we can do as well. So I'm going to ask that you email me, and I will have Tina place my email into the chat. If you want to go to the next slide. Additionally, our partner on this learning community, the National HPV Vaccination Roundtable, has a plethora of materials, especially around age 9. They actually have an article collection that's ongoing, collecting articles around age 9 and a video that accompanies it. So I highly would recommend that you look at that and review it. They also have a Start at 9 campaign and a toolkit filled with cell sheets, letter templates, videos, social media resources, posters, reminder cards, and so much more. So you will have access to that as well. Next slide. Additionally, I want to highlight the American Academy of Pediatrics. They have a ton of resources, and those include some professional tools and resources, such as an HPV discussion guide that has both a parental information on one side and then also professional information on the other. And it's actually available in multiple languages. They too have flyers, they have reminder cards, they have materials around age 9. They also have a toolkit that includes social media, videos, and articles that you could use as well. And then next slide, I do want to share that the CDC has released a new version of their immunization schedule for those 7 to 18-year-old adolescents. And as you can see on this slide in particular, that updated schedule shows HPV vaccination recommended at age 9. So this would be a great resource that you could put in your exam rooms for patient and parent education, especially as we're coming into the summer months, and this is the time that kids are going to be coming for their vaccines. Next slide. So we quickly shared some of our favorite HPV vaccination resources, but I know there's so many more out there, and we would love to hear what resources you are using. So I'm going to ask Tina if you could please pull up the poll, and if each of you could quickly just share some of the resources that you use to educate patients and parents. I will go ahead and compile those and put them into our resource roundup so everyone can have access to them. All right, it looks like we slowly have individuals participating. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to see what resources you guys are going to share with us. I'm going to go ahead and give it another 30 seconds. In the meantime, this is our upcoming curriculum schedule. So we are currently in May, and we will have a session here on June 12th that will talk around our ABCs of quality improvement. So this will start our summer schedule around quality improvement, and we are going to hear from Josh Kellums at HealthLink, who will be sharing his knowledge and his experience around AIM statements and building a QI team, along with a new group of panelists who are going to share their experience building AIM statements and QI teams. Additionally, everyone should have received, after last month's session, a full calendar of invites for our learning community from now until December. And if you didn't, please email me and let me know. If not, I look forward to seeing you in the coming months. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And as always, we want to end our calls with a call to action. So once again, I encourage you to not only look at our website, once again, Tina, if you could link that in the chat, but also please bookmark it for future use. Look through all the materials we referenced in today's call. Hopefully you can utilize some of them in the next coming months as individuals are coming for the vaccines. And as we prepare for our June session, I ask that you maybe pull your baseline HPV vaccination rates and start working on an AIM statement or a problem statement. Start to build out your quality improvement team who are going to work with you on increasing HPV vaccines, and then start identifying building plans and building an action plan for everyone. And then if you want to go to the next slide, as always, we want to know how today went and what you liked and what could go better. So we'll share a link in the chat as well in our follow-up email, but let us know anything you want to learn for future sessions. If you're interested in sharing a best practice or being a part of a panel, we would love to highlight you. We do want to make this learning community a positive experience and keep it relevant to each of you. So I want to thank you all again for joining today's session. I'm so sorry we went a couple of minutes over, but I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and take care, and we will follow up shortly.